She was cast out into the Wyoming wilderness with nothing but shame and a newborn child, left to die by her own father's righteous fury until a Sioux war chief found them frozen in the snow and wrapped them both in his sacred buffalo robe. Changing the course of 3 destinies forever, the morning of October 15th, 1876, dawned crisp and merciless over the settlement of Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory. The aspens on the mountainsides blazed gold against a sky so blue it hurt to look at, and the first serious frost of the season had turned the grass brittle underfoot. It should have been a morning of beauty, of preparation for the long winter ahead. Instead, it became the morning that tore apart the Morrison family and cast a young woman into the wilderness to die.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Margaret Morrison stood in the center of her father's trading post, her arms wrapped protectively around the bundle pressed against her chest. The baby, her son, was barely 12 hours old, born in the storm cellar while the October winds howled above them like banshees. She had labored alone, biting down on leather straps to keep from screaming, knowing that if anyone heard, if anyone came, her secret would be exposed before she was ready. But secrets, like winter, have a way of arriving whether you're prepared or not. Judge Cornelius Morrison stood across from her, his black coat billowing around him like the wings of some terrible bird of prey. His face was carved from granite, his eyes the color of winter storms, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. For 23 years, he had been the law in Bitter Creek, judge, jury, and executioner when necessary. He had hanged rustlers, sentenced claim jumpers to hard labor, and once personally shot a man who had dared to cheat at cards in his establishment. But nothing in his long career of dispensing frontier justice had prepared him for this moment, when the law he worshipped demanded he destroy his own daughter. "Margaret Elizabeth Morrison," he said, his voice echoing off the log walls of the trading post, "you stand before me accused of fornication, adultery, and bringing shame upon this family and this community. How do you answer?" Margaret lifted her chin, though her entire body trembled like a leaf in a storm. "I answer that I have done nothing wrong, Father. I have loved unwisely, perhaps, but I have not sinned." "You have birthed a bastard child," Cornelius roared, his composure finally cracking. "You have spread your legs for some man who wouldn't even give you his name, and now you dare stand in my house and speak of love? His name is Thomas Whitehorse," Margaret said quietly, and the admission hit the room like a physical blow. "Lieutenant Thomas Whitehorse of the 7th Cavalry. And he would have married me if he could have." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's stepmother, Constance, pressed herself against the wall, her face pale as bleached bone. Even the baby seemed to sense the danger, his tiny fists curling and uncurling against Margaret's chest. Cornelius Morrison's face went through a series of transformations: shock, disgust, and finally, a cold fury that was more terrifying than his earlier rage. "A half-breed," he whispered. "My daughter has whored herself to a half-breed savage." "He is a decorated officer in the United States Army," Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger despite her fear. "He is a graduate of West Point. He is a gentleman and a scholar, and he loved me truly. He is a mongrel dog who seduced my daughter and then ran back to his red-skinned relatives rather than face the consequences of his actions," Cornelius spat. "Where is this noble savage now, Margaret? Where is your Lieutenant Whitehorse when you need him most?" Margaret's composure finally cracked, and tears began to stream down her face. "He's dead, Father. He died at the Little Bighorn with General Custer. He died before he even knew about the baby." For a moment, something flickered across Cornelius Morrison's face, perhaps pity, perhaps regret. But it was gone so quickly, Margaret. "Might have imagined it. Then he has saved me the trouble of killing him myself," Cornelius said coldly. "But his death does not absolve you of your sins, Margaret. It does not wash clean the stain you have brought upon our name." Margaret looked around the room desperately, seeking some trace of mercy, some flicker of the father who had once taught her to read, who had bought her books from St. Louis, who had promised her mother on her deathbed that he would always protect their daughter. But that man was gone, replaced by this cold stranger who looked at her with such hatred. "Please," she whispered, "he's your grandson, your own blood." "He is no blood of mine," Cornelius replied. "He is the spawn of your wickedness, and I will not have him under my roof." Constance finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Cornelius, surely we can find some way." Silence. Cornelius turned on his second wife with such fury that she stumbled backward. "You will not speak in defense of this harlot. You will not poison my mind with womanish sentiment." He turned back to Margaret, and she saw her death sentence written in his eyes. "You have brought shame upon the Morrison name. You have violated the laws of God and man. You have consorted with savages and produced a half-breed abomination. Therefore, I judge you guilty of all charges, and I sentence you to banishment from this community and from this family." "Father, no," Margaret gasped. "It's October. Winter is coming." "You can't." "I can and I will," Cornelius interrupted. "You have 1 hour to gather what you can carry. Then you will leave this place and never return. If you are seen in Bitter Creek again, you will be arrested and hanged as a vagrant and a prostitute." Margaret felt the world spinning around her. The familiar walls of her childhood home suddenly foreign and hostile. Where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do with a newborn baby? "That is no longer my concern," Cornelius replied with chilling finality. "You made your choices, Margaret. Now you must live with the consequences." The next hour passed in a blur of desperate activity. Margaret packed what little she could into a canvas bag, her mother's Bible, a few pieces of clothing, a small pouch of coins she had hidden away over the years. Constance helped her in secret, slipping dried meat and hardtack into the bag when Cornelius wasn't looking, along with a bottle of laudanum and a small knife. "I'm sorry," Constance whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. If there was anything I could do, take care of yourself," Margaret replied, embracing her stepmother for what they both knew would be the last time. "He'll take his anger out on someone, and with me gone, it will be you." As the hour drew to a close, Margaret wrapped her son in the warmest blanket she could find and prepared to face the wilderness. She had hoped, perhaps, that her father's anger would cool, that he would relent at the last moment. But when she emerged from her room with her meager possessions, she found Cornelius waiting with his rifle across his knees. "Time's up," he said simply. Margaret walked through the trading post one last time, memorizing the details of the only home she had ever known. The pot-bellied stove where she had warmed herself on cold mornings. The desk where her father had taught her to write. The window where she had watched for Thomas Whitehurst's return from patrol. Never knowing that he would never come back. At the door, she turned back one final time. "Someday you'll regret this, Father. Someday you'll realize what you've thrown away." Cornelius Morrison's face remained impassive. "The only thing I regret is that I didn't raise you better. Now go, before I change my mind about letting you live." Margaret stepped out into the October morning, her baby clutched against her chest, her few belongings slung over her shoulder. Behind her, the door of the Morrison trading post slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. The settlement of Bitter Creek was already stirring as she walked down the main street, but no one met her eyes. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in small communities, and she could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on her from every window, every doorway. Children stopped their play to stare. Women pulled their skirts aside as she passed, as if her shame were something that could be caught like a disease. At the edge of town, she paused and looked back at the only life she had ever known.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The log buildings, the smoking chimneys, the people who had been her neighbors and friends for 23 years, all of it was lost to her now, as surely as if it had been consumed by fire. Margaret Morrison adjusted her baby's blanket, shouldered her pack, and began walking west toward the mountains. She had no destination in mind, no plan beyond finding shelter before nightfall. She only knew that she had to keep moving, had to put distance between herself and the town that had cast her out. Behind her, the smoke from Bitter Creek's chimneys rose straight up in the still morning air. Ahead of her lay the vast wilderness of the Wyoming Territory, beautiful and terrible, and utterly indifferent to the fate of one woman and her child. The baby began to cry as they crested the first ridge, his thin wail echoing across the empty landscape. Margaret hushed him gently, pressing him closer to her body for warmth. "It's all right, little one," she whispered. "Mama's here. Mama will take care of you." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. How could she take care of a newborn baby with winter coming and nowhere to go? How long could they serve in the wilderness with nothing but the contents of her pack and the fading warmth of an October sun? The first snow began to fall as the sun reached its zenith, light flakes that danced on the wind like ash from some distant fire. Margaret pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders and quickened her pace. She had to find shelter soon, had to find some way to keep her baby warm and fed. But the mountains stretched endlessly before her, indifferent to her plight, and the snow continued to fall, covering her tracks and erasing all trace of her passage. Within hours, it would be as if Margaret Morrison had never existed at all, as if the wilderness had simply swallowed her whole. Yet somewhere in those snow-covered peaks, something stirred. A presence that had been watching, waiting, following the tracks of the banished woman and her child. Someone who understood what it meant to be cast out, to be judged by the color of one's skin and the circumstances of one's birth. Someone who carried the blood of two worlds in his veins and had learned to find honor in places where others saw only shame. The snow fell harder now, blanketing the world in white silence. Margaret's feet were already numb despite her leather boots, and the baby's cries had grown weaker, more intermittent. She pressed on through the deepening drifts, her breath coming in short, visible puffs that crystallized and fell like tiny diamonds in the frigid air. By mid-afternoon, the storm had intensified into a full blizzard. The wind howled through the pines with a sound like tortured souls, and Margaret could barely see 10 feet ahead of her. Her pack felt heavier with each step, her arms ached from carrying the baby, and her legs trembled with exhaustion and cold. She stumbled over a hidden root and fell hard, instinctively twisting her body to protect her son from the impact. Baby's cries pierced the air, sharp and desperate, and Margaret realized with growing horror that she could no longer feel her fingers. The cold was seeping through her clothes, through her skin, settling into her bones like death itself, fighting back panic. She struggled to her feet and pressed on, but she was no longer walking in a straight line. The blizzard had disoriented her completely, and she might have been walking in circles for all she knew. The mountains looked the same from every angle, white and forbidding and utterly alien. As darkness began to fall, Margaret's strength finally gave out. She collapsed beside a large boulder, her body shaking uncontrollably, her lips blue with cold. The baby's cries had grown weaker still, and she knew with terrible certainty that they would both be dead before morning. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her son, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I'm so sorry, little one. I tried to keep you safe, but I wasn't strong enough." She closed her eyes and felt the snow settling on her face like a cold benediction. In the distance, she thought she heard the sound of hoofbeats, but she knew it was only her mind playing tricks on her, offering false hope in her final moments. But the hoofbeats grew louder, And with them came a voice, deep and commanding, speaking words in a language she didn't understand. Margaret forced her eyes open and saw a figure approaching through the swirling snow, a man on horseback, tall and broad-shouldered, his long black hair whipping in the wind. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating, that the cold had driven her mad. But then the man dismounted and knelt beside her, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. It was a face carved from copper and shadow, with high cheekbones and eyes like black fire. He wore buckskin and beadwork, and around his shoulders was draped a magnificent buffalo robe decorated with symbols she didn't recognize. "You are far from home, white woman," he said in accented English, his voice surprisingly gentle, "and your child grows cold." Margaret tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too violently to form words. Without hesitation, the man lifted the buffalo robe from his shoulders and wrapped it around both her and the baby. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming, and she felt tears freezing on her cheeks. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper. The man's eyes met hers, and she saw something there that she hadn't expected, not hatred or contempt, but understanding. "I am Standing Bear," he said simply, "War Chief of the Oglala Lakota. And you, white woman, are about to freeze to death in my territory." Margaret Morrison stared up at the Sioux war chief, her mind reeling. She should be terrified, she knew. The Sioux were enemies of the white settlers, had been at war with the army for years. This man might kill her and her baby without a second thought, but as Standing Bear gently lifted her from the snow, his massive arms cradling her and the baby as if they weighed nothing at all, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since learning of Thomas's death. She felt safe. The snow continued to fall as Standing Bear carried them toward his horse, but Margaret Morrison no longer feared the cold. Wrapped in the sacred buffalo robe of a Sioux war chief, she finally allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, her story was not ending but beginning. Standing Bear's horse was unlike any Margaret had ever seen, a magnificent paint stallion with markings like war paint across his chest and flanks. The animal stood perfectly still as his master approached, despite the howling wind and swirling snow, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Steam rose from the horse's nostrils in great puffs, and his dark eyes seemed to hold an intelligence that was almost human. "His name is Thunder Walker," Standing Bear said, noticing Margaret's amazed stare as he lifted her onto the horse's broad back. "He has carried me through many battles, but never cargo as precious as this." He settled behind her, his powerful arms creating a protective circle around both her and the baby. "Hold tight to my son," he murmured, and Margaret realized he was speaking not to her, but to the child nestled against her chest. The ride through the blizzard was like traveling through a dream made of ice and shadow. Standing Bear guided Thunder Walker with subtle shifts of his weight and quiet words in Lakota, navigating through terrain that would have been impossible for Margaret to traverse alone. The war chief's body radiated warmth, and the sacred buffalo Robe seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to ward off the bitter cold as they rode. Margaret found herself studying the man who had saved them. Standing Bear was perhaps 35 years old, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of leadership and hands scarred by countless battles. His face was marked by a thin line that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a war wound that spoke of violence survived and enemies defeated. Yet when he looked down at her baby, his expression held nothing but gentleness. "Why?" Margaret finally found the courage to ask, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Why did you save us?" Standing Bear was quiet for so long that she thought he hadn't heard her. Then, without taking his eyes from the path ahead, he began to speak. 20 winters ago, I was cast out from my own people. I had taken a white woman as my wife, a captive who became more than a captive. The elders said I had been poisoned by the Sioux ways, that I dishonored our blood by loving an enemy. Margaret felt her breath catch. The word Sioux was one she had heard before, the Lakota term for white people, and not a flattering one. "What happened to her?" Margaret asked softly. "She died giving birth to our son. The child lived only 3 days." Standing Bear's voice carried a weight of grief that transcended language and culture. "I buried them both on a hilltop overlooking the Powder River, and I swore on their graves that I would never again let pride and prejudice destroy what love had created." The implications of his words settled over Margaret like another layer of warmth. This man understood her situation in ways that her own father never could. He had walked the same path of judgment and rejection, had loved across the divide of race and culture, had lost everything to the cruelty of those who claimed to know better. After what felt like hours, they crested a ridge, and Margaret saw their destination, a hidden valley sheltered by towering pines and granite cliffs. Smoke rose from several tipis arranged in a semicircle around a central fire, and she could see figures moving between the dwellings despite the storm. But this was no ordinary Lakota village. As they drew closer, Margaret realized that the inhabitants were as diverse as a frontier trading post, Indians from various tribes, mixed blood families, even what appeared to be white settlers. "Welcome to the Valley of the Outcasts," Standing Bear said, with a hint of pride in his voice. "Here we have Lakota, who married white captives, Cheyenne, who refused to fight their white brothers, Crow, who chose peace over war, and Sioux, who found more honor among the savages than among their own people." A woman emerged from the largest tipi as they approached, tall and regal, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Her hair was streaked with premature silver, and her dress was a stunning combination of traditional beadwork and modern fabric. Margaret realized with shock that she was looking at another mixed-blood woman, someone who had navigated the treacherous waters between two worlds and emerged with dignity intact. "Husband," the woman called in accented English, "what storm gift do you bring us?" Standing Bear dismounted and lifted Margaret down with infinite care. "This is White Dove," he said, introducing the woman. "She speaks for the women of our village, and her word is law in all matters of hearth and home." White Dove approached Margaret with the measured gait of someone assessing a potential threat or ally. Her eyes, an unusual shade of green that spoke of mixed heritage, took in every detail of Margaret's appearance, from her travel-stained dress to the baby clutched against her chest. "She carries the child of two worlds," White Dove observed, her voice neither welcoming nor hostile. "I can see it in the shape of his face, the color of his skin. What is your story, sister?" Margaret found herself pouring out her tale: the love affair with Lieutenant Whitehorse, his death at Little Bighorn, her father's brutal judgment and banishment. As she spoke, a crowd gathered around them, drawn by curiosity and the universal human hunger for stories of love and loss. When she finished, White Dove was quiet for a long moment, her green eyes studying Margaret's face as if reading the truth written there. Finally, she nodded slowly. "You are welcome here, sister. Your child is welcome here. We know the taste of rejection, the weight of judgment. We know what it means to love without permission and pay the price for our heart's choices." Standing Bear placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "The storm will pass, but you need not leave when it does. We have learned that strength comes not from purity of blood, but from purity of purpose. Here, you will find family among strangers, acceptance among outcasts." White Dove led Margaret to a tipi that had been prepared with astonishing speed. Inside, a fire crackled warmly, and furs had been arranged to create a comfortable sleeping area. Other women of the village appeared as if by magic, bringing food, clean clothes, and most importantly, experienced hands to help with the baby. "He is beautiful," murmured an elderly Cheyenne woman named Singing Wind as she examined the infant. "Strong lungs, bright eyes. This one will be a warrior, I think, but a warrior for peace rather than war." As the women bustled around her, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the simple joy of female companionship. These women understood her situation without judgment, helped without condescension, and accepted her child as readily as if he had been born among them. White Dove returned with a bowl of rich stew and a cup of herbal tea. "Eat," she commanded. Gently. "You have grown thin with worry and sorrow. A nursing mother needs strength." As Margaret ate, White Dove sat beside her and began to share the stories of the valley's other inhabitants. There was Joseph Crow Feather, a Lakota warrior who had married his white captive and been exiled for refusing to give her up. Marie Lightfoot, a French trader's daughter who had fallen in love with a Crow chief and chosen his world over her. David Two Hawks, a cavalry scout of mixed Cherokee and Irish blood, who had deserted rather than participate in the massacre of peaceful villages. "Each of us came here broken," White Dove explained. "Cast out by those who claimed to love. U.S. rejected by those who were supposed to protect us. But standing there saw something that others could not, that the space between worlds can become a world unto itself if you have the courage to claim it." Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but inside the warm tipi, Margaret felt a different kind of weather changing. For the first time since learning of Thomas's death, she felt the possibility of hope, of belonging, of a future that might hold more than mere survival. Standing Bear appeared in the doorway, having changed. From his traveling clothes into the regalia of his office, a magnificent war shirt decorated with eagle feathers and porcupine quills, leggings fringed with scalp locks taken in honorable combat, and around his neck, a choker made from the claws of the grizzly bear that had given him his name. "The storm passes," he announced. "Tomorrow we hunt. Tonight we welcome our new sister." With the proper ceremony, Margaret looked up at him, this man who had saved her life without hesitation, who had offered sanctuary without condition. "I don't understand," she said. "You owe me nothing. You don't even know me. Why are you doing this?" Standing Bear knelt beside her, his dark eyes serious. "When I found you in the snow, dying with your child in your arms, I saw something I recognized. I saw the price that love demands when it crosses the boundaries that small minds have drawn. I saw courage in the face of judgment, dignity in the midst of despair." He paused, then continued more softly. "But most of all, I saw my wife's face in yours, my son's face in your child's. The dead cannot be brought back, Margaret Morrison, but the living can be saved. Tonight, you are no longer in exile. Tonight, you become part of something larger than yourself." As if summoned by his words, the sound of drums began to echo through the valley, joined soon after by voices raised in song. The ceremony of welcome was beginning, and Margaret Morrison, outcast daughter, grieving mother, woman without a home, was about to discover that family could be chosen as well as born, that honor could be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest warriors were those who fought not with weapons, but with compassion. The sacred buffalo robe that had saved her life still lay across her shoulders, and Margaret pulled it closer as she prepared to step into her new life. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, she knew. But tonight, surrounded by the warmth of acceptance and the promise of belonging, she allowed herself to believe that her story might have a happy ending after all. The drums grew louder, calling her to join the circle of firelight where her new family waited. Margaret Morrison took a deep breath, adjusted her baby in her arms, and stepped forward into the unknown future that awaited her in the Valley of the Outcasts. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's arrival in the Valley of the Outcasts, and the October snow had given way to the bitter winds of November. She had settled into the rhythm of the community with surprising ease, learning to tan hides alongside White Dove, grinding corn with the other women, and listening to the children practice their lessons in both English and Lakota. Her son, whom she had named Thomas in honor of his fallen father, had grown stronger and more alert, his dark eyes following the movements of his new extended family with curious intelligence. But peace, Margaret was learning, was a fragile thing. In the Wyoming Territory of 1876, the victory at Little Bighorn had brought terrible retribution upon all native peoples, and even their hidden valley was not immune to the growing tensions that swept across the frontier like wildfire. The trouble began with the arrival of a lone rider on a frost-covered morning. Margaret was teaching letters to a group of mixed-blood children when the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the valley. The children immediately fell silent, their games forgotten as they pressed close to the adults. In this place of outcasts, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. The rider was a young Lakota warrior named Swift Arrow, his face painted with the symbols of urgent news. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the cold, and blood seeped from a bandage wrapped around his left arm. He spoke rapidly in Lakota to Standing Bear, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to deliver his message. Margaret watched Standing Bear's face grow grave as he listened. The war chief's jaw tightened, and his hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt. Around them, the other adults began to gather, sensing the urgency in Swift Arrow's manner and the darkness in Standing Bear's expression. "What is it?" White Dove asked in English, her green eyes sharp with concern. Standing Bear turned to address the assembled community, his voice carrying the authority of leadership but also the weight of terrible news. "Colonel Nelson Miles is marching this way with a full regiment of cavalry. They seek to punish all Lakota for the victory at the Greasy Grass, and they make no distinction between warrior and woman, between the guilty and the innocent." A murmur of fear rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt her blood turn to ice as she clutched Thomas closer to her chest. She had heard stories of what happened when the army came seeking vengeance: villages burned, families scattered, children taken to distant schools to be stripped of their heritage and their names. "How long do we have?" asked Joseph Crow Feather, the exiled warrior who had become Standing Bear's war chief. "2 days, perhaps 3, Swift Arrow replied in broken English. "They follow the old buffalo trail that leads to the northern pass. If they continue on their current path, they will find this valley." Standing Bear nodded grimly. "Then we must prepare. The women and children will be taken to the high caves where they can hide until the soldiers pass. The warriors will create false trails to lead the cavalry away from our sanctuary. And if they don't follow the false trails?" White Dove asked quietly. Standing Bear's expression grew even more grim. "Then we fight, and we die protecting what we have built here." Margaret felt the world spinning around her as the implications of Standing Bear's words sank in. These people had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go, had accepted her child when her own father had rejected him. Now they faced destruction because they had dared to create a place where love mattered more than the color of one's skin. "No," she said, stepping forward before she could think better of it. "There has to be another way." Standing Bear turned to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "What would you have us do, Margaret? Surrender ourselves to the mercy of men who show no mercy? Allow them to destroy everything we have built here?" Margaret's mind raced as she considered the possibilities. She knew Colonel Miles by reputation, a hard man, but not an evil one. A soldier who followed orders, but who also valued honor above blind obedience. If she could reach him, if she could make him understand what this place truly was. "Let me go to them," she said, her voice growing stronger as the plan took shape in her mind. "Let me speak to Colonel Miles. I'm white, the daughter of a respected judge. He'll listen to me." "Absolutely not," Standing Bear replied immediately. "It's too dangerous. You don't know what these soldiers might do to a white woman traveling alone." "I won't be alone," Margaret said, her resolve hardening. "I'll take Thomas with me. When Colonel Miles sees a white woman with a mixed-blood child, when he hears my story, he'll understand that this place is different, that the people here aren't his enemies." White Dove shook her head vehemently. "Margaret, you don't understand how the Wissahickon think. They won't see a community of outcasts trying to live in peace. They'll see a white woman who has been corrupted by savage influences, and they'll see your child as proof of that corruption. Then what would you have me do? Margaret demanded, her voice rising with desperation. Sit in a cave and hide while the people who saved my life face death or worse? I won't do it. I can't do it. Standing Bear studied her face for a long moment, seeing something there that made him pause. You would risk your life for us? You would face the cavalry knowing they might reject your words and punish you for speaking them. You risked your life for me, Margaret replied simply. You wrapped me in your sacred robe when I was dying in the snow. You brought me into your family when I had no family left. How could I do any less for you? The debate that followed was fierce and emotional. Some argued that sending Margaret to parley with the cavalry was their best hope of avoiding bloodshed. Others insisted that it was too dangerous, that she would be walking into a trap with no guarantee of success. White Dove was particularly adamant in her opposition, arguing that Margaret didn't understand the depths of hatred that the army harbored for anyone associated with Native peoples. But Margaret had made up her mind, and she possessed a stubbornness that reminded Standing Bear of his long-dead wife. As the argument swirled around her, she quietly went about making her preparations. She dressed in her finest remaining clothes, a blue wool dress that had belonged to her mother, a matching bonnet that she had somehow managed to preserve through all her trials. She wrapped Thomas in the softest blanket the village could provide and pinned to his chest a small silver cross that had been her grandmother's. When Standing Bear found her making these preparations, he sat down beside her with a heavy sigh. You are determined to do this thing, aren't you? I am, Margaret replied without hesitation. Then you will not go alone, he said quietly. I will ride with you part of the way, close enough to watch over you, but far enough away that the soldiers will not see me as a threat. Standing Bear. No, he interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of absolute decision. You have shown courage enough for 10 warriors, but courage without wisdom is merely a quick path to death. If you are determined to risk your life for our people, then I am determined to do everything in my power to see that you survive the attempt. That evening, as the community made its final preparations for the coming confrontation, Margaret found herself standing at the edge of the valley, looking out toward the distant mountains where Colonel Miles and his cavalry would soon appear. Thomas slept peacefully in her arms, blissfully unaware of the danger that approached with each passing hour. White Dove approached her from behind, moving with the silent grace that had earned her name. You are afraid, the older woman observed quietly. Terrified, Margaret admitted, but also strangely at peace. For the first time since Thomas died, I feel like I'm doing something that matters, something that he would be proud of. Your Thomas was a warrior, White Dove said softly. Standing Bear has told me of him, of how he died fighting beside Custer at the greasy grass. He chose his side in that battle, and he died with honor. Now you choose your side, and you face your own battle. Margaret turned to look at the woman who had become like a sister to her. Will you take care of Thomas if something happens to me? White Dove's green eyes flashed with emotion. Nothing will happen to you. Standing Bear will see to that. But yes, if the unthinkable occurs, your son will be raised as one of our own. He will know his father's name and his mother's courage. This I swear on the sacred fire that burns at the heart of our village. As dawn broke over the valley the next morning, Margaret Morrison prepared to ride out to meet the advancing cavalry. She had written a letter explaining her actions and her hopes, sealed it with wax, and given it to White Dove to keep. She had kissed the sleeping children goodbye and embraced each of the women who had become her family. Now she stood beside Thunder Walker, Standing Bear's magnificent paint stallion, as the war chief made his own preparations for the dangerous journey ahead. He had painted his face with symbols of protection and had braided eagle feathers into his hair. Around his shoulders, he wore the same sacred buffalo robe that had saved Margaret's life 3 weeks earlier. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice gentle despite the gravity of the moment. Margaret looked back at the valley one last time, memorizing the faces of the people she had come to love, storing up the image of the only place that had ever truly felt like home. Then she mounted Thunder Walker's back, settled Thomas securely in his carrier, and nodded to Standing Bear. "I'm ready," she said, and met at Dot as they rode out of the valley toward an uncertain fate. Margaret Morrison could not have known that her courage was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined, or that the choices she made in the next few hours would determine not only her own survival, but the survival of everyone she had learned to love. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, and in the distance, the dust cloud raised by Colonel Miles's cavalry grew larger and more ominous. Somewhere beyond the horizon, two worlds were about to collide, and a young mother, carrying a mixed-blood child, was the only thing standing between peace and bloodshed. Margaret Morrison rode toward her destiny, wrapped in a sacred buffalo robe, and armed with nothing but love, hope, and a faith that courage could sometimes triumph over hatred. Behind her, the Valley of the Outcasts held its collective breath and waited to see if their white sister could work a miracle that would save them all. The cavalry regiment appeared on the horizon like a dark storm cloud, their blue uniforms a stark contrast against the golden autumn grass of the Wyoming prairie. Margaret could see the glint of sunlight on sabers and rifle barrels, could hear the rhythmic thunder of hundreds of hooves striking the earth in perfect military precision. At the head of the column rode a man whose bearing spoke of absolute authority, Colonel Nelson Miles, the same officer who had earned his reputation hunting down Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse across the northern plains. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she urged Thunder Walker forward, Standing Bear having melted away into the landscape behind her, according to their plan. The war chief would remain close enough to intervene if things went badly, but far enough away to avoid provoking the soldiers into immediate violence. Everything now depended on her ability to reach past the hatred and fear that had consumed both sides since Little Bighorn. The cavalry scouts spotted her first, lone woman on horseback approaching their column with what appeared to be a child in her arms. Margaret could see the confusion in their faces, the way their hands moved instinctively toward their weapons before their training reasserted itself. This was not what they had expected to encounter in the wilderness of hostile territory. "Colonel." Miles raised his hand, and the entire regiment came to a halt with military precision. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the snorting of horses and the creak of leather. Margaret could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes upon her as she continued her approach, and she forced herself to maintain her composure despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "Colonel Miles," she called out when she was still 50 yards away, her voice carrying clearly across the prairie air. "I request permission to approach under a flag of truce." The colonel spurred his horse forward, flanked by two of his officers and a civilian scout whose weathered face spoke of long years on the frontier. As they drew closer, Margaret could see the suspicion in their eyes, the way they studied her appearance for signs of deception or threat. "Madam," Colonel Miles said formally, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a career military officer, "you are either very brave or very foolish to be traveling alone in this territory. State your name and your business." Margaret straightened in her saddle, drawing upon reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "My name is Margaret Morrison, daughter of Judge Cornelius Morrison of Bitter Creek. I come seeking an audience with you, Colonel, on a matter of urgent importance." The civilian scout leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes narrowing as he studied her face. "Morrison ... that name's familiar. Ain't there a trading post family by that name over in the Bitter Creek settlement?" "There was," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the pain that admission caused. "I am no longer welcome there." Colonel Miles' expression remained impassive, but Margaret caught a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. And why, Miss Morrison, would the daughter of a respected frontier judge be riding alone through hostile territory with what appears to be an infant child? This was the moment Margaret had been preparing for, the moment when everything would either succeed or fail based on her ability to make these hard men understand the complexities of love and loss that had brought her to this place. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her words carefully chosen but delivered with absolute sincerity. Because, Colonel Miles, I am the mother of a mixed-blood child, cast out by my own father for the sin of loving a man whose heritage he could not accept. The child's father was Lieutenant Thomas Whitehorse of the 7th Cavalry, who died with honor at Little Bighorn, serving under General Custer. The impact of her words was immediate and profound. The officers exchanged glances, laden with meaning, while the civilian scout's face went pale with recognition. The name Whitehorse was known throughout the frontier, the mixed-blood officer who had served with distinction in numerous campaigns, who had been personally commended by Custer himself for his courage and tactical brilliance. Thomas Whitehorse. Colonel Miles repeated slowly, his voice heavy with memory. I knew him well. He was a good soldier and a good man, regardless of his parentage. His death was a great loss to the service. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but she forced herself to continue. Then you understand, Colonel, why I stand before you now. I seek not to excuse the actions of those who fought at Little Bighorn, but to prevent further bloodshed that would serve no purpose save vengeance. Explain yourself, Miles commanded, his tone sharp but not unkind. Margaret gestured toward the distant mountains where the Valley of the Outcasts lay hidden. 3 weeks ago, I was dying in a blizzard with my newborn son, cast out by my father and left to perish in the wilderness. I was found by Standing Bear, war chief of the Oglala Lakota, who saved my life and brought me to his community. The mention of Standing Bear's name caused an immediate stir among the soldiers. Several officers reached for their weapons, while the scout spat contemptuously into the dust. Standing Bear, Colonel Miles said grimly. The butcher of Crow Creek, the savage who led the war party that ambushed Captain Harrison's patrol last spring. The same man who wrapped me in my dying child in his sacred buffalo robe and carried us to safety, Margaret replied firmly. The same man who leads a community of outcasts from many tribes, people who have chosen peace over war, love over hatred. She could see the disbelief in their faces, the struggle to reconcile their preconceptions with the reality she was presenting. These were men who had spent years fighting the Lakota, who had seen friends and comrades killed in the endless cycle of violence that had consumed the frontier. The idea that their enemy could be capable of mercy was almost impossible for them to accept. You expect us to believe, one of the younger officers said skeptically, that Standing Bear, the same warrior who has killed dozens of our soldiers, suddenly developed a conscience and decided to play nursemaid to a white woman and her half-breed child? The contempt in his voice when he spoke of Thomas made Margaret's blood boil, but she forced herself to remain calm. Anger would serve no purpose here. Only truth and reason had any hope of success. I expect you to believe what I have seen with my own eyes, she replied evenly. Standing Bear's community consists of Lakota who married white captives, Cheyenne who refused to fight their white brothers, Crow who chose peace over war, and white settlers who found more honor among the savages than among their own people. They are outcasts, Colonel, just as I am an outcast. They have created a place where the color of one's skin matters less than the content of one's character. Colonel Miles studied her face intently, his experienced eyes searching for any sign of deception. Margaret met his gaze steadily, allowing him to see the truth written in her expression, the sincerity of her convictions. Even if what you say is true, he said finally, it changes nothing. My orders are clear to pacify this region and ensure that no hostile elements remain to threaten white settlements. I cannot simply ignore the presence of a known war leader like Standing Bear based on the word of one woman, regardless of her sincerity. Margaret felt despair rising in her throat, but she pushed it down. She had come too far to give up now. Then come and see for yourself, she said boldly. Come to the valley as my guest, under my protection. See with your own eyes what Standing Bear has built there. Judge for yourself whether these people pose a threat to anyone. The suggestion caused an immediate outcry among the officers. The idea of walking into what could be an elaborate trap, of trusting their lives to the word of a woman who had been living among hostiles, struck them as the height of folly. Absolutely not, the young officer declared. It's obviously a trap. Colonel, she's been turned by the savages, convinced to lure us into an ambush. But Colonel Miles held up a hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. She could see him weighing the options, calculating the risks and benefits of her proposal. Here was a man who had built his career on making difficult decisions under impossible circumstances, and she could only hope that his experience would help him see past the prejudices of his subordinates. You would stake your life on this? He asked quietly. You would guarantee safe passage for me and my men based on your faith in these people who have taken you in. I would, Margaret replied without hesitation. I staked my life and the life of my child on the honor of Standing Bear and his people. The silence that followed stretched for what felt like an eternity. Margaret could hear the wind whistling. Through the grass, the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. The restless movement of the cavalry horses as they waited for their commander's decision. Everything she had worked for, everything she had risked, hung in the balance of this moment. Finally, Colonel Miles spoke. Very well, Miss Morrison. Against my better judgment and the counsel of my officers, I will accept your invitation. But understand this, I will bring a full company of my best men, and if this proves to be a trap, if any harm comes to my soldiers, the consequences will be swift and terrible. Margaret felt a surge of relief so powerful, it nearly knocked her from her saddle. She had done it. She had convinced the colonel to give Standing Bear's people a chance. But even as she savored this small victory, she knew that the real test was yet to come. Words had bought them time, but only actions would determine whether peace or war would prevail. Thank you, Colonel, she said simply. You will not regret this decision. I hope not, Miss Morrison, Miles replied grimly. For all our sakes, I hope not. As the cavalry prepared to follow her toward the hidden valley, Margaret Morrison offered a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening. She had gambled everything on her faith in the people who had saved her life, and now the moment of truth was at hand. In the next few hours she would discover whether love could truly triumph over hatred, whether courage could overcome prejudice, and whether the family she had found among outcasts could survive the judgment of the world that had cast them all aside. Behind her, Thunderwalker's hoofbeats drummed a steady rhythm as they rode toward destiny, while ahead lay the valley of the outcasts and the confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone she had learned to love. Margaret Morrison had chosen her side, and now she would face the consequences of that choice, whatever they might be. The Valley of the Outcasts had never seen anything like the sight that greeted it. On that November afternoon, a full company of United States cavalry, their blue uniforms brilliant against the autumn landscape, rode down into the hidden sanctuary in perfect formation. At their head rode Colonel Miles, his face a mask of professional composure, while behind him Margaret Morrison carried her son and silently prayed that her faith in Standing Bear's people would not prove to be misplaced. The reaction in the valley was immediate and electric. Children scattered like startled birds, running to hide behind their mothers' skirts. Warriors who had been working peacefully on winter preparations suddenly appeared with weapons in hand, their faces painted with the grim determination of men prepared to die defending their families. The very air seemed to crackle with tension as two worlds that had been at war for Generations suddenly found themselves face to face in the most intimate of settings. Standing Bear emerged from his lodge with the dignity of a man who had been expecting this moment all his life. He wore his finest regalia, a war shirt decorated with eagle feathers and porcupine quills, leggings fringed with the hair of enemy, scalps, and around his shoulders, a magnificent buffalo robe painted with the symbols of his many victories. His face was painted with the red and black designs of a Lakota war chief, and in his hand he carried a lance topped with eagle feathers and coup marks. But it was his eyes that commanded attention, dark, intelligent, and utterly fearless as they met the gaze of Colonel Miles across the space that separated them. Here were two leaders, each representing a way of life that the other's people had been trying to destroy, finally meeting in a place where the rules of warfare no longer applied. Colonel Miles, Standing Bear said in careful English, his voice carrying across the valley like a ceremonial drum. "You are welcome in the Valley of the Outcasts. I am Standing Bear, War Chief of the Oglala Lakota, and these are my people." Colonel Miles dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his saber but not drawing it. His eyes swept across the valley, taking in every detail, the mixture of tipis and log cabins, the gardens where corn and squash grew side by side, the children, whose faces showed the blending of many races, the adults who watched with expressions ranging from fear to curiosity to defiant pride. "Chief Standing Bear," Miles replied formally, "I come here not as an enemy, but as a representative of the United States government, seeking to understand the nature of this community and its intentions toward the settlements in this territory." "White!" Dove appeared at Standing Bear's side, her green eyes flashing with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She had exchanged her usual work dress for a magnificent gown that combined traditional Lakota beadwork with fabric that had clearly come from the finest Eastern stores. Her silver-streaked hair was braided with ribbons and feathers, and around her neck she wore a choker made from elk teeth and turquoise. "Colonel," she said in English that carried only the faintest trace of accent, "I am White Dove, wife to Standing Bear and speaker for the women of this village. Will you share our fire and hear our stories before you pass judgment upon us?" The invitation was both a courtesy and a challenge, and Colonel Miles recognized it as such. To refuse would be to admit that he had come here already convinced of their guilt. To accept would be to acknowledge them as human beings worthy of respect and consideration. "I will," he said after a moment's consideration. "But my men remain armed and ready. I hope you understand the precautions I must take." "As do mine," Standing Bear replied, gesturing toward the warriors who stood at strategic points around the valley. "We are not fools, Colonel. We know that. Trust must be earned, not given." What followed was unlike anything in military experience of Colonel Miles or his officers. They were led to the central fire pit of the village, where buffalo robes and blankets had been arranged in a great circle. Women appeared with bowls of stew and corn bread. Children peeked out from behind their mothers to stare at the blue-coated soldiers, and men who had fought against the army for years sat down to share a meal with their former enemies. Standing Bear took his place at the head of the circle, with White Dove beside him and Margaret Morrison seated in the place of honor. At his right hand, Colonel Miles sat across from them, flanked by his senior officers, while the rest of his company remained mounted and alert around the perimeter of the gathering. "Before we speak of the present," Standing Bear began, "let us speak of the past, so that you may understand how we came to be here." He gestured to a middle-aged man with graying hair and intelligent eyes. "This is Joseph Crow Feather, once a warrior of the Oglala Lakota. Tell the colonel your story, brother." Joseph Crow Feather rose slowly, his weathered face reflecting a lifetime of hard choices and their consequences. "I was born in the time when the buffalo covered the plains like grass," he began, his voice carrying the rhythm of traditional storytelling. "I took my first scalp when I was 16 winters old, fought in many battles against the Bluecoats and their Indian allies. But in my 25th winter, I captured a white woman during a raid on a wagon train." He paused, his eyes finding those of a blonde woman sitting nearby with 2 children of mixed heritage. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was traveling with her family to Oregon. I took her as my captive, intending to trade her for horses and guns. But something happened that I had not expected. She showed me kindness even in captivity. She tended my wounds when I was injured, taught me words in her language, sang songs to comfort the children who had lost their parents in the raid. The circle was silent, except for the crackling of the fire as Joseph continued his tale. In time, kindness became something more. I gave her the choice to return to her people or remain with me as my wife. She chose to stay, and we were married. In the Lakota way. Our love was pure and strong, and we were happy for 7 years. His voice grew heavy with old pain. But when the army came to make treaty at Fort Laramie, the white negotiators demanded that all captives be returned to their people. I refused to give up my wife, and Sarah refused to leave me. The Indian agent said I was a savage who had corrupted a civilized woman, and the tribal elders said I had been poisoned by white influence. We were cast out by both worlds, labeled as traitors to our races. Colonel Miles leaned forward, his interest clearly engaged despite himself. "And what happened then?" "We wandered for 2 years, finding no place that would accept us," Joseph replied. "Our children were rejected by white settlements and Indian villages alike. We nearly starved. That second winter, living in a cave in the mountains, surviving on roots and what little game I could kill. Then Standing Bear found us." All eyes turned back to the war chief, who had been listening with the patient attention of someone who had heard this story many times, but never tired of its telling. "I found them dying," Standing Bear said simply. "A warrior, his white wife, and their 2 children, all of them outcasts like myself. I brought them here, to this valley that had become my sanctuary, and they became the first members of what would grow into this community." White Dove rose gracefully and gestured to others around the circle. Marie Lightfoot, daughter of a French trader who fell in love with a Crow chief and was disowned by her family. David Two Hawks, a cavalry scout of Cherokee blood who deserted, rather than participate in the massacre of peaceful villages. Robert Standing Elk, a Cheyenne warrior who refused to fight when he learned that his own half-brother rode with Custer's scouts. One by one, she introduced the members of their community, each with a story of love that had crossed racial boundaries, of choices that had led to exile from their birth families, of the courage required to build new lives in the face of rejection. From both worlds. As the stories continued, Margaret watched Colonel Miles' face carefully, searching for any sign that the man behind the uniform was being moved by what he heard. She saw his eyes linger on the children playing at the edge of the circle, children who represented the future of 2 races learning to live as one. She saw him notice the obvious prosperity of the community, the careful balance between Indian and white customs, the absence of the squalor and desperation that characterized so many frontier settlements. When the last story had been told, Standing Bear rose to his feet and addressed the colonel directly. "You have heard our stories, Colonel Miles. You have seen our home, met our families, shared our food. Now I ask you, do we look like savages? To you, do our children look like threats to your civilization?" Colonel Miles was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving slowly around the circle, taking in the faces of people who were neither fully Indian nor fully white, but something new and unprecedented on the American frontier. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of consideration that had been absent before. "What I see here," he said carefully, "is remarkable. I see a community that has found a way to bridge differences that have led to warfare and bloodshed across this continent. I see families who have chosen love over hatred, acceptance over prejudice." He paused, then continued more slowly. "But I also see a problem that cannot be ignored. This valley lies within territory that has been designated for white settlement. The government in Washington has made commitments to homesteaders, to railroad companies, to mining interests. They will not simply ignore this land because it has become home to outcasts, no matter how noble their intentions. Margaret felt her heart sink as she recognized the direction of his words. Even if Colonel Miles was sympathetic to their cause, he was still bound by orders from superiors who would never understand or accept what Standing Bear had built here. Standing Bear seemed to sense her despair, for he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder before addressing the colonel again. Then, "What would you have us do, Colonel? Where would you have us go? Our children were born here. Our dead are buried in this soil. This valley is not just our home, it is our hearts, our souls, our very reason for being." "I don't know," Colonel Miles admitted, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "I came here expecting to find a band of hostile warriors. Instead, I find something that challenges everything I thought I knew about the conflict between our peoples. You have given me much to think about, Chief Standing Bear, much to consider." The gathering was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, many hoofbeats, coming fast from the direction of the valley's entrance. Standing Bear was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his weapon, while Colonel Miles shouted orders to his men to prepare for action. What appeared at the rim of the valley was Margaret's worst nightmare made manifest. Her father, Judge Cornelius Morrison, leading a posse of armed men from Bitter Creek. Their faces were hard with righteous anger, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun, and at their head rode the man who had cast his own daughter out to die rather than accept the love she had found across racial lines. "Margaret!" Judge Morrison's voice boomed across the valley like thunder. "Come away from those savages immediately. I've come to rescue you from this den of corruption and sin." Margaret felt the world spinning around her as she realized that her two worlds were about to collide in the most violent and tragic way possible. On one side stood the people who had saved her life and accepted her child. On the other stood the father who had rejected her, but who now claimed to want her back. In that moment, Margaret Morrison knew that she faced the most important choice of her life. And whatever she decided would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of everyone she had learned to love in the Valley of the Outcasts. The confrontation that had been building since the moment she first wrapped her son in Standing Bear's sacred buffalo robe was finally at hand, and there would be no avoiding the consequences of the choices that had brought them all to this moment of reckoning. The silence that followed Judge Morrison's thunderous proclamation was deafening, broken only by the nervous stamping of horses and the whisper of wind through the valley pines. Three armed forces now faced each other in the heart of the Valley of the Outcasts. Colonel Miles with his disciplined cavalry, Judge Morrison with his vigilante posse, and Standing Bear with his warriors who had emerged from concealment like ghosts materializing from the earth itself. Margaret Morrison stood frozen in the center of it all, her son clutched to her chest, knowing that her next words could either prevent a massacre or trigger the very bloodbath she had risked everything to avoid. She could feel the weight of every gaze upon her father's righteous fury, Colonel Miles' conflicted duty, Standing Bear's protective concern, and White Dove's sisterly faith. "Father," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence, "I am not your prisoner here. I am not being held against my will. These people saved my life when you left me to die in the wilderness." Judge Morrison's face darkened with rage as he spurred his horse forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt. "Saved you? They've corrupted you, filled your head with savage nonsense. Look at yourself, Margaret, living like an animal among heathens, allowing them to influence my grandson with their pagan ways." "Your grandson?" Margaret's voice rose with incredulous anger. "You called him an abomination. You said he was no blood of yours. You cast us both out to freeze and starve rather than acknowledge his existence." The men of Morrison's posse shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, perhaps beginning to understand that this was not the simple rescue mission their leader had described. Several of them were fathers themselves, and the idea of abandoning daughter and grandchild to certain death sat uneasily with their consciences. Colonel Miles stepped forward, his voice cutting through the family drama with military authority. "Judge Morrison, I presume, your timing is most unfortunate. I am conducting official business here under military jurisdiction." "Military jurisdiction be damned," Morrison snarled. "That's my daughter among those savages, and I'll not leave without her. These Indians have committed an act of war by harboring a white woman and child." "On the contrary," Miles replied coolly, "from what I've observed, your daughter came here of her own free will after being banished from her home. If anyone has committed an act of war, it might be you, bringing armed men onto federal territory without authorization." Standing Bear had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the dignity of a chief addressing foreign dignitaries. "Judge Morrison," he said in his careful English, "your daughter came to us dying in a blizzard, cast out by her own blood. We gave her shelter, food, and acceptance when her own people showed her only rejection. What manner of father abandons his child to the wolves, then claims righteousness when others show her mercy? I will not be lectured by a savage." Morrison spat, his face purple with rage. "Margaret, get away from that red devil and come home where you belong. I've spoken with Reverend Patterson, and he's willing to perform a cleansing ceremony. Your sins can be forgiven, your shame washed clean. But you must renounce these heathens and return to civilized society." Margaret looked around the circle of faces that had become her family, White Dove, who had taught her the strength that came from choosing love over duty. Joseph Crow Feather and his wife Sarah, who had shown her that marriages across racial lines could create something beautiful. The children of mixed heritage who played together without seeing color or bloodline, only friendship and kinship. Then she looked at her father, this man who claimed to love her, but had proven willing to destroy her rather than accept her choices. She saw the fear in his eyes, not just fear of Indians or of social scandal, but fear of a world that was changing faster than he could understand. Fear of losing the rigid certainties that had governed his life. "No, father," she said quietly, but with absolute finality. "I will not return to Bitter Creek. I will not submit to your cleansing ceremonies or beg forgiveness for loving Thomas Whitehorse. I will not allow you to poison my son's mind with hatred for half of his heritage." Judge Morrison's face went white with shock. "You would choose these savages over your own blood? You would condemn your child to grow up among heathens, rather than give him the benefits of Christian civilization?" "I choose love over hatred," Margaret replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I choose acceptance over judgment. I choose a family that embraces my son for who he is, rather than one that sees him as a stain to be erased." She turned to address Colonel Miles, knowing that his decision would ultimately determine the fate of everyone in the valley. "Colonel, you've seen this community with your own eyes. You've heard their stories, shared their food, witnessed their humanity. These people are not the enemy. They're not savages or threats to civilization. They're families trying to build lives based on love rather than prejudice." Colonel Miles stood in thought for a long moment, his weathered face reflecting the weight of a decision that would echo through history. When he finally spoke, his words carried the authority of absolute command. "Judge Morrison, I'm ordering you and your men to withdraw immediately. This community poses no threat to white settlements, and your daughter has made her choice as a free citizen of the United States. Any attempt to remove her by force will be considered kidnapping and will be met with military intervention." Morrison's face contorted with fury. "You're protecting savages over your own race. When Washington hears about this," Miles interrupted coldly, "they'll hear my full report on what I found here. They'll learn about a remarkable experiment in peaceful coexistence that could serve as a model for ending the Indian Wars once and for all. They'll hear about an innovative community that has found ways to bridge racial divides that have plagued this nation since its founding. He turned to address Standing Bear directly. Chief, I cannot guarantee that the government will allow you to remain here indefinitely. Political winds change, and there are powerful interests who want these lands for development. But I can guarantee that you'll have time to prepare, time to make your case to higher authorities, time to show the world what you've accomplished here. Standing Bear nodded gravely. We ask for nothing more than the chance to prove that there is another way, Colonel. A way that honors both the Red Road and the White Road. That allows children to grow up knowing pride in all parts of their heritage. White Dove stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in soft doeskin. Colonel Miles, she said formally, you have shown wisdom and courage today. You have chosen to see with your heart as well as your eyes. Please accept this gift as a token of our respect. She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a magnificent war shirt, decorated with beadwork that must have taken months to complete. The designs told a story, scenes of buffalo hunts and winter camps, of warriors and women, of children playing in summer grass. But woven throughout the traditional images were new symbols, eagles and stars flying together, different colored. Hands joined in friendship, families of mixed heritage standing united under the same sky. It tells the story of what we've built here, White Dove explained. The old ways and the new ways coming together to create something that neither could achieve alone. Colonel Miles accepted the gift with visible emotion. I am honored, he said simply. I will wear it with pride, and I will remember what I've learned in this valley. Judge Morrison made one last desperate attempt to reclaim his daughter. Margaret, please. You're throwing your life away, condemning yourself and your child to poverty and exile. Come home with me, and I promise things will be different. I'll accept the boy, find him a place in society. You can have a real life, a civilized life. Margaret looked at her father with something approaching pity. Father, you still don't understand. This is my real life. These are my real people. And my son doesn't need you to find him a place in society. He already has one. Right here, where he's valued for who he is rather than judged for who his parents were. She walked over to Standing Bear and placed her hand on his arm. One choose. This family, she said clearly, so that everyone present could hear. I choose this life. I choose love. Judge Morrison stared at his daughter for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman she had become, rather than the obedient child he remembered. His shoulders sagged with defeat as he realized that the daughter he had cast out was lost to him forever. Then you are no daughter of mine, he said bitterly, echoing the words he had spoken months earlier in his trading post. No, Margaret replied with quiet dignity, I am not. I am something better. I am a woman who has learned that family is not defined by blood alone, but by the bonds of love and acceptance we choose to forge. As Judge Morrison and his posse rode away in defeat, and Colonel Miles prepared his men for the journey back to their fort, the Valley of the Outcasts settled into a new kind of peace. The immediate crisis had passed, but everyone understood that greater challenges lay ahead. The government would eventually take notice of their community, and powerful interests would covet their land. But for now, in this moment, they had won. Something precious: recognition of their humanity, validation of their choices, and the promise of time to build something that could serve as an example to the world. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret Morrison sat beside the central fire with her son in her arms. Standing Bear's sacred buffalo robe was draped around her shoulders, but now it felt less like borrowed protection and more like a symbol of belonging. What will you call him? White Dove asked, settling beside them with her own children gathered close. Margaret looked down at her son, this child who represented the future of two worlds, learning to become one. Thomas Standing Bear Morrison, she said finally. Thomas for his father, Standing Bear for the man who saved us both, and Morrison because some names are worth keeping, even when the families that bear them prove unworthy of them. Standing Bear himself approached, carrying something small wrapped in soft leather. "For the boy," he said simply, unwrapping a tiny pair of moccasins decorated with beadwork that matched his own war shirt. "Every warrior needs proper footwear for the journey ahead." As Margaret slipped the moccasins onto her son's tiny feet, she marveled at how perfectly they fit. Like everything else in this valley of outcasts, they represented the blending of two traditions into something new and beautiful. The drums began to sound as darkness fell, calling the community to gather for the evening meal. Margaret Morrison rose to join them, carrying her son toward the fire where her chosen family waited. Behind her, the sacred buffalo robe trailed in the grass, no longer a barrier against the cold, but a bridge between worlds, a symbol of the love that had conquered hatred and the courage that had chosen acceptance over fear. In the valley of the outcasts, where the banished had become the blessed and the rejected had found redemption, a new story was just beginning. And at its heart was a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest act of rebellion is simply refusing to let others define who you are allowed to love. 10 years had passed since the confrontation in the Valley of the Outcasts, and the world beyond its protective mountains had changed in ways that few could have predicted. The year 1886 brought with it the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the end of the great buffalo herds, and the final surrender of the last free Indian tribes. But within the hidden sanctuary that Standing Bear had created, a different kind of history was being written, one measured not in battles won or territories claimed, but in children who grew up knowing that love could transcend any boundary. Margaret Morrison, though she had long since taken the name Margaret Standing Bear in the Lakota tradition, stood at the edge of the valley's eastern ridge, watching her son Thomas as he practiced his horsemanship with the other children. At 10 years old, he was already showing signs of the warrior he would become, but it was a different kind of warrior than any the frontier had ever known. His skin carried the bronze of his father's Lakota heritage, but his eyes held the gray-green of his mother's Irish ancestry. More importantly, his heart held the wisdom of both worlds, the strength that came from understanding that identity was not about choosing sides, but about embracing the complexity of who you truly were. "He rides like his grandfather," said a voice behind her, and Margaret turned to see Standing Bear approaching. The war chief had aged gracefully in the decades since their first meeting, his hair now streaked with silver, his face marked by the fine lines that came from years of leadership and responsibility. But his eyes still held the same fierce intelligence and gentle strength that had convinced Margaret to trust him with her life and her son's future. "Which grandfather?" Margaret asked with a smile, knowing that Standing Bear had claimed Thomas as his own grandson in every way that mattered. "Both, I think," Standing Bear replied, settling beside her on the rocky outcrop. "Thomas Whitehorse was said to be the finest horseman in the 7th Cavalry, and my own father could ride before he could walk. The boy carries the best of all his bloodlines." They watched in comfortable silence as Thomas guided his pony through a series of complex maneuvers, his movements fluid and confident. Around him, other children of the valley practiced their own skills, some working with traditional Lakota weapons, others learning the farming techniques that would help the community remain self-sufficient, still others studying the letters and numbers that would allow them to navigate the white world when necessary. The Valley of the Outcasts had grown substantially in the decade since Colonel Miles' visit. Word had spread, carried by traders and military scouts, of a place where mixed-blood families could find acceptance, where white settlers could learn to live in harmony with native peoples, where the rigid boundaries of race and culture had given way to something more flexible and humane. They now numbered nearly 200 souls, representing dozens of tribes and nationalities, all united by their shared experience of rejection and their common commitment to building something better. "Margaret," Standing Bear said quietly, "there is something we must discuss, something that concerns Thomas and his future." Margaret felt a familiar flutter of anxiety in her chest. In the past year, there had been increasing pressure from federal authorities for the community to relocate to designated reservation lands. The Indian Wars were ending, and with them the government's tolerance for independent native communities, no matter how peaceful their intentions. "What is it?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "A letter came yesterday from Colonel Miles. He has been promoted to general and transferred to Washington, where he serves as an advisor on Indian affairs. He writes that there is growing sentiment in Congress to establish a formal school here. A place where Indian children can be educated in both their traditional culture and in the ways they will need to survive in the modern world." Margaret frowned, remembering the horror stories she had heard about the government's Indian boarding schools, where children were forcibly separated from their families and stripped of everything that made them who they were. "What kind of school?" "Not the kind you're thinking of," Standing Bear assured her. "Miles writes that he has been advocating for a new approach, one based on what he observed here. A school that would teach children to be proud of their heritage while also preparing them for the realities of the world beyond the reservation. He wants to use our community as a model, Margaret. He wants to show Washington that there is another way." The implications of Standing Bear's words settled over Margaret like a weight. Such recognition would bring safety and legitimacy to their community, but it would also bring scrutiny, regulation, and the loss of the independence that had made their experiment possible. "And what do you think?" she asked. Standing Bear was quiet for a long moment, his eyes following Thomas as the boy dismounted and began helping some of the younger children with their riding. "I think," he said finally, "that we have always known this day would come. We have built something beautiful here, something that has given hope to people who had none. But we built it knowing that its true purpose was not to hide from the world, but to show the world what was possible." Margaret understood what he was saying, even as her heart rebelled against it. The Valley of the Outcasts had been their sanctuary, their refuge from a world that had rejected them. But sanctuaries, by their very nature, were temporary things. Their real purpose was to give people the strength and skills they needed to go back out into the world and make it better. "When?" she asked. "The delegation arrives in the spring. They want to observe our methods, interview our families, assess whether what we've created here can be replicated elsewhere." Standing Bear paused, then continued more softly. "Margaret, they specifically want to meet Thomas. Word has reached Washington of a boy who represents the successful blending of two cultures, who speaks both Lakota and English with equal fluency, who can hunt with bow and arrow in the morning and solve mathematical equations in the afternoon." Margaret felt a surge of protective fear. Thomas was still a child, barely 10 years old. The idea of him being paraded before government officials as some kind of symbol or curiosity made her blood run cold. "I won't let them use him," she said fiercely. "I won't let them turn him into a symbol for their political purposes." "No," Standing Bear agreed, "you won't. But you might let him choose to be a bridge between worlds, just as his parents chose to be. The boy has a gift, Margaret. And not just for languages or writing or hunting. He has the gift of being able to see people as they truly are, beyond the color of their skin or the customs they follow. That gift could be powerful in the right hands." As if summoned by their conversation, Thomas appeared at the base of the ridge, climbing toward them with the easy grace of a mountain goat. As he drew closer, Margaret could see the excitement in his eyes, the kind of eager energy that meant he had news to share. "Mother, grandfather," he called out, using the Lakota term for Standing Bear that had come naturally to him from his earliest words. "White Dove says the supply wagon is coming up the valley trail. And there's someone with them, someone she's never seen before." Standing Bear and Margaret exchanged glances. Unexpected visitors still caused anxiety in the valley, despite the years of peace they had enjoyed. Too many of their number had memories of soldiers and officials arriving with ultimatums and eviction notices. They made their way down to the valley floor, where a crowd had already gathered around the approaching wagon. Margaret could see that it was indeed their regular supply wagon, driven by their old friend Samuel Hutchins, a mixed-blood trader who had been bringing them goods from the outside world for years. But beside him on the wagon seat sat a figure that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. It was a woman, perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of refined bearing that spoke of education and social position. Her traveling dress was well made but practical, and her face held the determined expression of someone on a mission of great importance. But it was her eyes that caught Margaret's attention, gray-green eyes that looked remarkably familiar. "My name is Catherine Whitehorse," the woman announced as she climbed down from the wagon, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering crowd. "I am the sister of Lieutenant Thomas Whitehorse, and I have come seeking his son." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret felt the world spinning around her as she stared at this woman who claimed to be Thomas's sister, this aunt that her son had never known existed. Standing Bear's hand found her shoulder, steadying her as she struggled to process this unexpected development. Catherine Whitehorse's eyes moved across the crowd until they found Margaret, and some instinct seemed to tell her immediately who she was looking at. "You must be Margaret," she said, her voice softer now, filled with emotion. "My brother wrote to me about you, about your love story. His letters stopped coming after he was assigned to Custer's regiment, and I feared the worst. Thomas is dead," Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He died at Little Bighorn." "I know," Catherine replied, tears glistening in her eyes. "I've spent the last 10 years trying to find out what happened to you and his child. The army told me you had both died in the wilderness, but I never stopped believing that you might have survived." Young Thomas, who had been watching this exchange with growing understanding, stepped forward with the natural curiosity of childhood. "Are you really my father's sister?" he asked, his voice clear and unafraid. Catherine knelt to his level, her eyes drinking in every detail of his face. Margaret could see her searching for traces of her lost brother in the boy's features, finding them in the shape of his nose, the set of his shoulders, the intelligent way he studied her in return. "I am," she said softly. "You have your father's eyes and his fearless spirit, I think. He would have been so proud of you. What do you want?" Margaret asked, her protective instincts aroused by this unexpected intrusion into their carefully constructed world. Catherine rose gracefully, her expression serious but not unkind. "I want to know my nephew," she said simply. "I want to share stories about his father, to tell him about the family he's never known. And I want to offer him opportunities that might not be available here, no matter how wonderful this place might be." Margaret felt Standing Bear's hand tighten on her shoulder, and she drew strength from his presence. "What kind of opportunities?" "Education," Catherine replied. "I am the headmistress of a preparatory school in Boston. We have recently begun accepting students of Native heritage, students who can benefit from the kind of education that will prepare them for leadership in the modern world. Thomas could attend our school, learn about his father's family and heritage, while still maintaining his connection to the life he's built here." The offer was generous, even tempting, but Margaret felt every protective instinct she possessed rising up in opposition. Thomas was her son, her responsibility, and the idea of sending him away to strangers filled her with dread. "He's only 10 years old," she said. "He's too young to be sent away from his family." "I'm not suggesting he leave permanently," Catherine said gently. "I'm suggesting he spend part of each year with me in Boston, learning about the wider world, and part of each year here with you and his extended family. The boy is going to need both influences if he's to fulfill his potential." Thomas had been listening to this conversation with the intense concentration that Margaret had learned to recognize as his thinking face. Now he looked up at her with those remarkable eyes that held so much of his father's intelligence and determination. "Mother," he said quietly, "I would like to know about my father's family. And I would like to learn about the world beyond the valley. But I would never want to leave here forever. This is my home, and these are my people." Margaret knelt beside her son, studying his face as carefully as Catherine had moments before. In his expression, she saw the same courage that had carried her through the darkest moments of her own life, the same willingness to embrace complexity and change rather than retreating into comfortable certainty. "Are you sure?" she asked. "It would mean leaving everything you know, at least for part of each year." "Yes," Thomas said without hesitation. "Grandfather Standing Bear has always taught me that a warrior must be prepared to walk in both worlds. I think this is my chance to learn how to do that." Standing Bear knelt beside them, completing the circle. "The boy is wise beyond his years," he said quietly. "And he is right. We have always known that his destiny would be larger than this valley, important as this place has been in shaping him." Margaret looked around at the faces of her chosen family, seeing understanding and support in their expressions. White Dove nodded encouragingly, while Joseph Crow Feather and his wife, Sarah, smiled with the kind of pride that parents feel when their children take their first steps toward independence. "Very well," Margaret said finally, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. "Thomas may spend part of each year with his aunt in Boston, learning about his father's world. But he will always return here, to us, to the place that made him who he is." Catherine Whitehorse smiled, and in that expression, Margaret caught a glimpse of the brother she had loved and lost. "I wouldn't have it any other way," she said. "This valley has clearly given him something precious, the knowledge that he belongs somewhere, that he is valued for who he is rather than what others expect him to be." As the sun set over the Valley of the Outcast that evening, Margaret Morrison Standing Bear sat by the central fire with her son in her arms, just as she had 10 years earlier on the night of her arrival. But now the sacred buffalo robe that had once sheltered her from death was draped around a boy who would carry its lessons of love and acceptance into a world that desperately needed both. The drums began to sound, calling the community to their evening meal, but Margaret lingered for a moment longer, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to show the world that love could indeed conquer hatred, that acceptance could triumph over prejudice, that the boundaries people drew between themselves were far less important than the bridges they could choose to build. In the Valley of the Outcasts, where the banished had become the blessed and the rejected had found redemption, the sacred buffalo robe continued to shelter those who needed its protection. And somewhere in the distant future, Margaret knew, her son would carry its lessons forward, becoming the bridge between worlds that both his fathers, the one who had given him life and the one who had given him love, had always hoped he would be. The story that had begun with a young woman cast out into a blizzard had become a legacy of hope that would echo through generations, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of courage come not from fighting against the world, but from refusing to let the world's hatred define who you are allowed to love.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.